What would you do if a duke handed you the keys to a place no one else would set foot in, and told you plainly that the milk had spoiled for years and the last dairymaid had fled before her first wage was paid? In the autumn of 1863, 22-year-old Eleanor Cole was given a damp, shunned dairy on a neglected estate near Willow Dean, on the single condition that she make it work again, a condition the whole county had already declared impossible. But what happened in that cold stone cellar over the seasons that followed would carry her name onto the order books of London merchants who had never heard of her village. Settle in, stay close, and let us know where you're watching from. The coach put her down at the crossroads a full mile short of the estate, because the driver would not take his horses further along a lane that had been let go to weeds and standing water. Eleanor Cole climbed down with a small leather trunk in one hand and a wrapped bundle in the other, and stood a moment in the thin October light while the coach rattled away behind her. She was 22 years old and dressed in a mended wool traveling dress the color of wet slate, with a black bonnet whose ribbons had faded to gray. Her boots were her mother's, resoled twice. Her hands, red at the knuckles, had known the inside of a dairy pail since she was 9. She had buried her father in the spring and her mother 6 weeks after him, and the small tenancy that had held all 3 of them had passed to a cousin who did not care to keep her on. She had written to 3 houses seeking a place. 2 had not replied. The 3rd had passed her letter along to a steward, who had passed it along to a factor, who had, by some improbable route, laid it before the Duke of Ashenmere himself. The Duke was old and tired of his agents, and had a stretch of land near Willow Dean that no one wanted to farm. He had scrawled a line in the margin of her letter, and sent it back with a purse of 2 sovereigns for the coach. The line read, "Let the Cole girl try the dairy. No one else will." Eleanor walked. The lane ran between hedges gone unkempt, hawthorn tangled with bramble, the ditches choked with black leaves. A single crow watched her from a fence post and did not lift when she passed. The air smelled of wet earth and cold iron. She had not eaten since a bit of bread at dawn, and the bundle in her hand held everything she owned that was not on her back. A cheesecloth, a wooden spoon that had been her grandmother's, a small book of receipts written in her mother's careful hand, and a folded letter with the Duke's line at the bottom. Halfway along the lane she passed a cottage where a woman was drawing water from a pump. The woman looked up, took her measure, and said nothing at all. Then, as Eleanor drew even with the gate, the woman spoke. "You bound for Ashenmere?" "I am," Eleanor said. "The dairy?" "Yes." The woman set down her bucket. "God keep you, then." She said it flat, without warmth, the way one might say it over a coffin. Eleanor nodded once and walked on. The hedgerows closed in again. Somewhere ahead, past a bend she could not yet see, a rook called and was answered by another, and the wind moved through the wet grass with the sound of a slow hand across linen. She did not look back. The house came into view a quarter-hour later, though house was too generous a word for what stood at the end of the drive. Tuntiatas, the main hall of Ashenmere, lay somewhere further off, hidden behind a rise. What the factor had meant by the dairy was a low range of buildings set apart on their own paddock, cornered by a spinney of ash trees and fronted by a yard where nettles had grown chest-high through the cobbles. The dairy itself was a long stone shed with a slate roof sagging in the middle like the back of an old horse. Beyond it stood a byre with half its door missing, a cheese room with a boarded window, and, set a little apart, a cellar built into the slope of the ground, its wooden hatch black with mildew. The factor was waiting by the byre with a ring of keys and an expression that suggested he had come only because he had been ordered to. He was a narrow man in a gray coat, and he looked at Eleanor as though inspecting a mistake. "You're the Cole girl." "Eleanor Cole." "Aye. Well." He rattled the keys against his palm. "His Grace has his fancies. This is one." He led her across the yard without further ceremony, boots crushing the nettles. The dairy door was swollen in its frame and had to be shouldered open. Inside, the smell hit her before the light did. Sour, deep, old. Milk that had turned and turned again in the stones. The slate slabs along the walls were stained the color of tea. A copper vat in the corner had gone green. A single high window let in a bar of dishwater light that fell across the flagstones and showed the dust standing in it like slow snow. "Last 3 girls run off inside a week," the factor said. He did not lower his voice. "1 inside a day. Milk sours in the pail here. Sours in the churn. Sours in the mouth, some say." Eleanor set her trunk down on the flagstones. She did not answer. "There's a herd," he went on. 15 head. Half of them dry, half of them near it. There's a cottage yonder for you to sleep in, if you can stomach it. The Duke's paid a quarter's wage in advance. When you go, and you will go, the wage is not to be returned. He was firm on that. He held the keys out. She took them. They were cold and heavier than she had expected, and the largest of them was worn smooth on one side where a thumb had rested against it, over and over, for a very long time. "Anyone in the village who might come and help?" she asked. The factor gave a short laugh through his nose. "Not for this place. Not for love nor coin." He looked around the sour room once more, as though to be certain it was as bad as he remembered, and then back at her. "You've a week, girl. Perhaps 2. Then the coach comes past again on Fridays." He touched his hat, more out of habit than courtesy, and left her standing in the bar of gray light with the keys in her hand. Would you have taken those keys, knowing what the whole county already knew? Would you have stayed one night in a place the villagers crossed themselves to name? And what, in that sour dark, was still waiting to be found? If a quiet story of patience and hidden worth is your kind of evening, leave a comment and subscribe so the next one finds you. Because Eleanor did not follow the factor out. She closed the door behind him and turned back to the room. The dairy did not welcome her. It only allowed her, the way an old sick animal allows a hand near its flank, because it has no strength left to snap. She walked its length once, quietly, past the stained slabs and the green copper and the cold hearth, and she made a list in her head of what she must have before nightfall. Bread, a little tea, tallow for a candle, a bundle of dry kindling, if any could be begged. The cottage the factor had spoken of stood at the far end of the paddock, its thatch soft with moss. She looked in only long enough to see a bedstead, a stool, a hearth choked with jackdaw twigs. Then she took up her bundle and went back down the lane the way she had come, because the village lay another mile along it, and there was no bread in her bundle, and no fire in the grate, and a Friday coach was not a thing to be trusted against hunger. The village of Willow Dean was one long street of stone cottages leaning toward one another like old women sharing a secret. A forge stood at its head. A public house sat at its middle with a painted board too weathered to read. At its foot rose the squat gray church with its yews. A woman shaking a cloth from a doorway saw Eleanor coming and did not shake it again. A boy hooping a barrel across the road stopped his hoop and stared. By the time Eleanor reached the baker's, 3 faces had already withdrawn behind window glass, and the whispering had begun in that soft, competent way that country whispering has. moving from door to door faster than any horse. The baker's wife was civil, in the manner of a woman who intends to speak of a customer the moment the customer is gone. She weighed out the loaf. She wrapped it in paper. She took Eleanor's coin. She said nothing beyond the price. Only as Eleanor turned to leave did she allow herself the small mercy of a question, spoken low. "You'll be up at the Ashenmere Dairy, then?" "I will," Eleanor said. The woman's mouth thinned. "Mind you don't drink the milk." Eleanor did not ask what she meant. She had learned long since that a question in a strange village bought only silence and a longer look. She stepped out into the street with the loaf under her arm, and there, standing in the road as though he had grown out of the cobbles to meet her, was a man in a fine bottle-green coat with a riding crop tucked under his elbow and a face pink from the wind. Behind him, a boy held the reins of a bay mare. 2 farmers had drifted out of the public house to watch. "You'll be the coal girl," he said. His voice was pitched to Carrie, "the one His Grace has set at that ruin." "I am," Eleanor said. "Squire Hallworth," he answered, though she had not asked. He looked her up and down without hurry. The mended dress, the resoled boots, the red knuckles on the hand that held the bread. He might as well have set a sparrow to plow. That yard hasn't given a wholesome pound of butter in 20 years. Milk turns in the pail up there. The cows know it. My own factor wouldn't take the ground if he offered it rent-free, and I told him so. He gave the small, pleased laugh of a man who enjoys the sound of his own good sense. "A quarter's wage in advance, I hear. Well, spend it careful, girl. It's more than the place will give you." Someone by the public house door laughed. A woman across the street laughed after, as though permission had been granted. Eleanor stood with the loaf against her ribs and did not answer. Silence, she had learned, was a kind of shelter one could carry. "No retort," the squire said, pleased. "Good. Save your breath for the walk back." He touched his crop to his hat and swung up onto the mare, and the little audience by the public house door melted back into it with the small, satisfied murmur of a crowd that has seen what it came for. Eleanor walked on. She bought tea from a shop that would not meet her eye, tallow from a chandler who took her coin between 2 fingers as if it might be damp, and a bundle of faggots from a boy at the forge who whispered something to another boy the moment her back was turned. She was nearly clear of the village when she came upon the churchyard gate, and there, sitting on the low wall in a black shawl with her hands folded on a stick, was a very old woman with eyes the pale blue of winter sky. The old woman watched her come, and Eleanor slowed because it seemed rude to hurry past a person so plainly waiting. "You are going to the Ashenmere Dairy," the old woman said. It was not a question. "I am." The old woman looked at her a long moment. Her mouth moved once as though tasting a word before letting it out. "The room remembers who was kind to it," she said. "Be kind to the room." Eleanor waited in case there was more. There was not. The old woman folded her hands again on the stick and looked past her at the church, and the audience was ended as clearly as if a curtain had been drawn. Eleanor said quietly, "Thank you," and walked on, and did not look back until she was well beyond the last cottage. And when she did, the wall was empty. By the time she reached the estate lane again, the light had thinned to the color of pewter, and a fine, slow rain had begun to fall. The kind of rain that does not seem to be falling at all until one finds oneself wet through. The nettles in the dairy yard bent under it. The slates of the sagging roof darkened one by one. She let herself in at the cottage door with the smallest of the cold keys and stood a moment on the threshold, listening. The cottage smelled of soot and old straw, and the particular sweet, sour breath of a place that has not been warmed in a season. She set the loaf and the tea and the tallow on the table. She swept the jackdaw twigs from the hearth with the side of her boot. It took her 3 attempts to strike a fire from the damp kindling. When at last a small flame took, she fed it patiently, breath by breath, until it stood on its own. She hung her bonnet on a nail. She took off her wet shawl and spread it over the stool. She cut a slice of bread and toasted it on the point of a knife, and ate it slowly with a mouthful of black tea from a tin cup she had carried in her bundle. Then, because she could not sleep with the dairy unseen, she took the tallow candle in its dish and crossed the yard through the soft rain to the long stone shed, and unlocked the swollen door, and went inside. The single high window showed nothing now but rain against a darkening square of sky. The candle throwing its small yellow ring on the flagstones made the room feel larger, not smaller. She walked its length with the light held out before her. She touched the slate slabs one by one, and they were cold under her fingers, and not, as she had half feared, greasy. She looked into the green copper vat, and saw at its bottom, beneath the verdigris, the faint sound mark of a maker's stamp. She stood a long moment at the cellar hatch, and did not open it. Not tonight. Tonight was for listening. She sat down at last on her heels in the middle of the flagstones and set the candle before her, and closed her eyes, and listened. The rain on the slates, a drip somewhere at the far end, slow, patient. The sigh of the ash trees beyond the wall, a cow out in the byre, shifting its weight in the straw. And under all of it, under the rain and the drip and the wind and the beast, a deeper quiet, the quiet of a room that had been waiting to be spoken to. "Be kind to the room," the old woman had said. Eleanor opened her eyes. She did not yet know what the words meant, but she bowed her head to the flagstones as though to something older than herself, and she said, aloud, into the dark, "I will do what I can." Then she took up the candle and locked the door behind her, and went back across the yard through the rain to the cottage, and to a bed that was not hers, in a house that was not hers, on land that was not hers, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman who has nothing left to lose. She woke before dawn to the sound of a cow lowing across the yard, one long note carried thin on wet air. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then the smell of soot and stale straw returned her to the cottage, and to the day, and to the work. Eleanor rose in the dark. She dressed by feel, laced her boots, and set the kettle on the raked embers. While the water heated, she opened the door and stood on the threshold and looked out. The rain had gone in the night. A low mist lay along the paddock like a laid cloth. Beyond it, the ash trees stood black and dripping. The slates of the dairy roof shone as though washed. She drank her tea standing, ate the heel of yesterday's loaf, took up the ring of keys, and crossed the yard. She meant only to look at the herd first. That was the sensible order of things. But at the byre door, as she lifted the latch, something small and gray slipped past her ankle from inside and vanished under the stack of broken hurdles by the wall. A cat, thin, ash-colored, with one ear notched. It did not run far. It watched her from the shadow of the hurdles with pale, unblinking eyes. "Good morning," Eleanor said. The cat did not answer, which was as it should be. She left it where it was and went in to the cows. There were 15 head, as the factor had said. 6 were dry. 4 were near it. 5 were still in milk and stood knee-deep in soiled straw that had not been forked out in weeks. Their coats were dull. Their eyes were not. Eleanor moved down the line and laid a hand on each in turn. She spoke to them low, their ears turned toward her voice. When she reached the fifth, a broad red cow with a white star, the animal leaned its weight gently against her shoulder and held it there. And Eleanor stood a long moment, with her forehead against the warm flank, and did not move. She fetched a fork and began to muck out. It was while she was working the fork along the far wall of the byre, past the last stall, that she saw the beam. The byre had 8 roof beams, adze-hewn oak, black with age. 7 of them ran straight from wall to wall as roof beams ought. The 8th, the one nearest the far gable, did not. It had been set a full hand's breadth lower than its fellows, and it did not carry the roof at all. A shorter joist above did that. The low beam served no visible purpose. It simply crossed the byre alone, at the height of a tall man's brow. Eleanor set the fork against the wall and went to it. She ran her palm along its underside. The wood there was smoother than the rest, worn as a threshold is worn, as though something had passed beneath it, or been slung from it, day after day, for years. And near its center, cut into the oak with a fine, steady knife, there was a name. Not initials, a whole name, though the first part had been chiseled out, leaving only a rough scar. What remained after the scar was a surname, and beneath the surname a date. The date was 1841. Eleanor stood under the beam a long time with her hand on the letters. She did not know the surname. It was not Hallworth. It was not any name she had heard in the village. Whoever had cut it carefully, in the manner of a man who meant a thing to last, and whoever had struck the first name out had struck it out later, and in anger, with a chisel not meant for the job. She did not fetch a lamp. She did not go up the ladder to look closer. She only marked the place in her mind, and picked up the fork, and went on mucking out. But as she worked, her eye returned to the beam again and again, and the low quiet she had heard in the dairy the night before seemed to gather itself around that scarred name and wait. That was the first day. The second she gave to the dairy floor. She hauled water from the yard pump in a bucket that leaked at one seam and had to be tipped quickly. She scrubbed the flagstones with a bristle brush she found hanging on a nail behind the door, and with sand she carried up in her apron from the edge of the spinney. The water ran off brown, then gray, then, by the end of the morning, nearly clear. Under the tea-colored stain, the slate slabs along the wall came up a fine pale blue-gray, close-veined, cold to the touch even in noon light. They were not, she saw now, ordinary slabs. They had been chosen. Someone had gone to the trouble of choosing them. The cat came in around midday and sat in the doorway with its tail wrapped over its feet and watched her scrub. When she stopped to straighten her back, it blinked at her once, slowly. She fetched a saucer from the cottage, poured a little of the morning's milk into it. Milk she would not yet trust to a churn, and set it on the flagstones a yard from the door. The cat waited until she had turned away before it drank. By the third day she had cleared the copper vat. She took it down from its bracket, carried it out into the yard, and worked at it with sand and vinegar and the wooden spoon that had been her grandmother's, careful not to score the metal. The verdigris came away in green flakes. Under it the copper was sound, and at the bottom, where she had seen the ghost of a maker's stamp by candlelight, a mark stood clear now in the morning sun. A shield, and inside the shield a pair of crossed keys, and beneath the shield a town whose name she did not know how to sound. A continental stamp, not English, not local. A vat that had cost, in its day, more than the byre and the cottage together. She sat back on her heels in the wet yard and looked at it for a long while. She said nothing aloud. She only set the vat back on its bracket, cleaner than it had been in 20 years, and went to the cheese room next. The cheese room's boarded window came down under a crowbar she found rusted to a hook in the byre. Light fell into that room for the first time in what must have been a decade, and dust turned in it like slow snow. There were shelves along 3 walls, deep shelves, spaced for wheels of cheese, not for pats of butter. The wood of the shelves was scored where cloths had been slid off them 1,000 times. Along the topmost shelf, penciled faintly in a hand that had not been schooled in English, were words she could not read but knew for what they were. The names of cheeses, each above the place where its wheel had rested. Someone had made varieties here. Someone had kept a record. Someone had taken pride. Eleanor stood in the middle of the cheese room with the crowbar hanging from her hand, and looked at the penciled names, and felt for the first time since her mother's burying a small, warm movement in her chest that was not grief. The cat came in behind her and sat down against her boot. She did not speak. She only reached down, without looking, and laid one reddened knuckle for a moment against the notched ear, and the cat allowed it. Then she straightened and went back to work. By the end of the first week, the dairy floor was scrubbed, the copper hung clean, the cheese room aired, the byre forked out to bare cobble, and the 5 milking cows stood on fresh straw with combed flanks. Eleanor had not yet tried to make cheese. She was not ready. She was learning the rooms first, as one learns a stranger's face. Every night, she took the tallow candle and walked once through the buildings before locking up. Every night, the cat walked with her, a soft gray shape at her heel, in and out of the pool of light. Every night she passed under the low, scarred beam in the byre and touched the letters of the name that remained, and the date beneath, and did not yet ask whose name had been struck out, or why. But the rooms were speaking to her now, in the way a room speaks, through the wear of a threshold, the choice of a slab, the height of a shelf, the mark of a maker, the cut of a knife on oak. Her hands were listening before her mind knew it was being told a story, and somewhere she understood without yet framing the thought, there would be more. The second week began in cold, clear weather, and on the Monday morning Eleanor took the ring of keys and went at last to the cellar hatch. She had left it for last on purpose. The hatch was set into the slope behind the dairy, its planks black with mildew, its iron ring furred with rust. She had passed it 12 times a day, and each time turned her head toward it without stopping. The way one acknowledges a neighbor one is not yet ready to greet. Now she knelt in the wet grass, worked the smallest key into the lock, and lifted the hatch on hinges that groaned once and then held. The steps below were stone, 8 of them, and dry. That was the first surprise. She had expected water. She found instead a cool, still air that smelled of chalk and old straw and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of milk long carried away. She lit her tallow candle at the top and went down slowly. The cellar was longer than she had guessed from the hatch. It ran back into the slope in a shallow barrel vault of red brick, and along both sides ran stone thralls set at waist height, worn smooth. At the far end, the vault ended in a wall. Eleanor walked to the wall and set the candle on the thrall. The wall was wrong. She saw it in the way one sees a badly hung door. The brick at the end of the vault was newer than the brick to either side, and the mortar was pale where the rest was dark. Someone had bricked up the end of the cellar and taken pains to make it look old, and time had done the rest, but not enough. Along the top course, a hairline crack ran the width of the wall, and where the crack met the vault, a single brick had sagged half an inch below its neighbors. She stood a long moment with her hand flat against the newer brick. The cat had come down the steps behind her and sat at the foot of the stairs, watching, unblinking. Eleanor went up again for the crowbar. She worked at the sagged brick first, and it came out in her hands like a loose tooth. Behind it was darkness and cold air, and the smell of chalk deeper still. She set the brick aside and took out the next, and the next. She did not hurry. The candle threw her shadow long against the vault and made the shadow work with her. When she had made an opening the size of a small window, she lifted the candle and looked in. At first only shelves, slate shelves like those in the dairy above, cut from the same close-veined blue-gray stone, set into the brick with a mason's care. On the shelves, in slow rows, were the pale, round shapes of cheeses, 9 of them, dry now, hard as wood, wrapped in cloths gone the color of tea. They had been left there. They had been forgotten there. They had waited there 22 years. Eleanor did not touch them yet. She lifted the candle higher. At the back of the little chamber, on a low ledge, sat a tin box the size of a family Bible, and beside the box a folded apron of coarse linen, and beside the apron a wooden last for a man's boot. Small, worn. She took out more bricks until she could step through. She lifted the tin box down and carried it to the thrall by the candle and opened it. Inside was a notebook bound in dark green board, and beneath the notebook a bundle of letters tied with tape, and beneath the letters a paper folded 3 times and sealed with a blot of red wax bearing the Ashenmere crest. She opened the notebook first. The hand was fine and slanted and not schooled in English. The words on the first page she could not read, but the numbers she could. Quantities of milk, of rennet, of salt. Temperatures marked in a scale she half remembered from her mother's book. And the penciled names above the shelves upstairs walked down these pages in ink, each with its own receipt, its own hours, its own turn of the wheel. Page after page, year after year. And at the head of the first page, written plain in Roman letters, as though the writer had wished at least his own name to be read, a full name, Jonas Weiler, and beneath it, in the same hand, Ashenmere Dairy, 1834. The name on the beam, the surname that was not Hallworth. The date beneath the beam had been 1841. 7 years of pages ran from the first date to the last, and the last was a receipt not finished, breaking off mid-line. Eleanor set the notebook down and drew the letters toward her. She did not open them yet. She only looked at them and understood, all at once and without words, that the room had kept faith with the man who had made it, and had been waiting for someone who would ask. She looked up. The cat sat on the thrall opposite, tail curled, eyes half closed. "Jonas Weiler," Eleanor said aloud, once to the vault. The vault did not answer, but the low quiet she had heard on her first night in the dairy gathered close about the candle and about the tin box and about her hands, and she knelt on the flagstones of the cellar with her forehead against the edge of the thrall and wept, without sound, for a man she had not known, and for her father and her mother, and for the room, and for herself. When she rose, she wiped her face on her sleeve, took up the notebook and the letters and the sealed paper, and carried them up into the light. That night, the wind changed. It came down out of the northeast across the paddock and struck the sagging slates of the dairy roof at 3 in the morning. And Eleanor sat up in the bed in the cottage with her heart beating in her throat, and knew, before she was fully awake, that the roof would not hold. She dressed in the dark without lighting a candle. The wind was screaming under the eaves. A slate went off the byre and cracked on the cobbles. The cows in the byre were making the sound cows make when the world above them is coming apart. She pulled her mother's boots on over bare feet. Outside, the yard was black and running with water. The rain had come with the wind and was driving flat across the paddock. She fought her way to the byre with one hand held up against the sting of it, and got the door open, and the smell of warm animal came out at her, and the 5 milking cows stood shifting and heavy-eyed at their stalls. A slate crashed onto the cobbles behind her and burst into 3 pieces at her heel. The far end of the byre roof was going. She could hear it. The slow, woody groan of an old truss taking too much wind. If the far gable came down, the last stall would go with it, and the broad red cow with the white star stood in that stall. Eleanor did not stop to think. She untied the red cow and the 2 beside it, and led them out of the byre one at a time by the halter, through the rain, across the streaming yard, and into the dairy. The dairy roof, sagging as it was, sat lower and squatter, and had held for 150 years. She led them onto the scrubbed flagstones. Their hooves rang on the slate. They came without resisting, as though they had been waiting for someone to think of them. She went back for the last 2. She had the 4th cow through the dairy door when a shape moved in the corner of her eye at the paddock gate. A man, hunched, holding something. He came stumbling across the yard against the wind. He was not shouting, he had no breath for it. When the lamp from the cottage caught him for an instant, Eleanor saw a laborer's smock plastered to a thin frame, a face streaming, and the bundle in his arms held tight against his chest under his coat. A child, a small child, wrapped, still. "Please," the man said. The word was hardly a word. "Please, Mrs." Eleanor pointed at the cottage. He went. She got the 5th cow inside the dairy, threw the bolt, and ran through the rain to the cottage, and pushed the door open on him standing dripping in the middle of the floor, with the child pressed against him, and his eyes fixed on the fire she had banked before bed. "Set her down," Eleanor said. He knelt and laid the bundle on the hearthrug. The child was a girl, perhaps 3, blue about the mouth, breath shallow, hair pasted to her forehead. Eleanor was on her knees in the same movement. She peeled the wet shawl away and the wet dress under it, and wrapped the child in her own dry blanket from the bed, and rubbed the small cold hands between her red ones, and blew on the fire until it woke and threw heat, and set the kettle in the embers. "How long in the rain?" she said. 2 hours, the man said. His teeth were chattering. "The cart went in the ditch. I could not lift it. I saw your light. Sit." He sat on the stool by the fire. He would not let go of the child's foot, even as Eleanor worked. Outside, the wind hammered the cottage door on its latch, and a slate came off somewhere with a long, tearing sound, and Eleanor did not turn her head. She warmed milk from the pan she had left covered on the hearth. She dipped the corner of a clean cloth in it, and touched it to the child's lips, and again, and again. And on the 4th touch, the child's mouth moved. The man made a sound in his throat that was not a word. "She'll do," Eleanor said. "Drink." She poured tea for the man into her tin cup and pushed it into his hands. They sat by the fire, the 3 of them, while the roof of the byre came off in pieces above the yard, and the wind worked itself hoarse against the stones of the cottage. Eleanor did not go out again. The cows were in the dairy. The cellar was locked. The notebook and the letters and the sealed paper were in the tin box on the shelf above the hearth, and the tin box was dry. She sat on the flagstones with the child's head on her lap and one hand on the small, warm forehead, and did not sleep, and did not weep, and did not doubt. Somewhere before dawn, the wind fell. She understood then, sitting on the floor of her own cottage with a stranger's child breathing under her hand, that she would not go back on Friday's coach, nor on any coach. Whatever else the room asked of her, she would do. She had said so aloud on the flagstones on her first night, and the room had heard, and the room had opened its cellar and put a name into her hands, and the room, tonight, had held. She would hold too. By morning the yard was a wreckage of slate and broken hurdle, but the cottage stood, and inside the cottage the child slept warm against Eleanor's shoulder while the man drank a second cup of tea and would not meet her eye. His name, when at last he gave it, was Whitcomb. He was a carter out of the next parish who had taken the long lane in the dark because the low road was under water. When the light was strong enough, he went out to look at his cart, and Eleanor gave him bread wrapped in paper and told him to send word from the village when he came back with a horse. He touched his cap without speaking. The child, awake now and pink about the mouth, put out one small hand and closed it round Eleanor's finger before her father lifted her away. By the time Whitcomb had reached the public house at Willow Dean, the story was already ahead of him. A woman drawing water at the pump had seen him pass at dawn with the child on his shoulder, and a boy running for the baker had seen the byre roof lying in pieces across the paddock, and by noon the tale had grown a shape of its own, that the coal girl had brought 5 cows through a storm into the dairy alone, and had warmed a stranger's child back from the cold on her own hearth, and had not gone to any door for help. It did not travel as laughter travels. It traveled slowly, the way weather travels, and it settled. That afternoon, a man on a gray pony came up the lane. He was the estate's land agent out of the market town, sent because word had reached the Duke's factor that the byre at Ashenmere had lost its roof. He was a spare, courteous man in a black coat, and he walked the yard with Eleanor without speaking until she showed him the dairy floor scrubbed pale, the copper vat clean on its bracket, the cheese room aired, and last, the cellar. He held his hat in his hand at the foot of the 8 stone steps. He read the first page of the notebook in the light of the high window and set it down as one sets down a christening cup. "This was Weiler's hand," he said. "I remember him. A quiet man. He was here from the year I came up as a clerk." He did not say what had ended it. He said only, "His Grace should know of this." He wrote for a quarter of an hour at the cottage table, took the sealed paper with the Ashenmere crest carefully into his coat, and rode away before dusk. 3 days later, 2 men came from the estate with a load of timber and slate, and behind them a mason and a boy. They did not ask Eleanor where to begin. They began at the byre's far gable, and they worked without complaint. And when Eleanor brought them tea, one of them, an older man, took his cap off to drink it. It was the first cap taken off to her in that country. By the end of the 2nd week, she had lit the copper for the first time. She followed the notebook line by line in the hand of a man she had never met, and where the hand broke off, she carried on in her mother's book and in her own. The first wheel she pressed was small, careful, and unremarkable. She set it on the slate shelf in the hidden chamber, which she had opened up now to the light, and she turned it every morning as the notebook told her. The 2nd wheel was better. By the 5th, when she cut the rind with a clean knife and tasted the paste, she sat down on the flagstones and put her hand over her mouth. The vicar came in December, an unhurried man with cold, reddened ears, and blessed the rooms because Eleanor had asked. He would not take payment. He carried a small round of her cheese back to the rectory wrapped in a cloth, and a week after that, a letter came from the town, And a week after that, a hamper went by cart to a merchant in London, whose name the land agent had given her. 6 weeks after that, the land agent rode up the lane again with a folded paper in his hand and a rare small smile. A house in Jermyn Street had written for Ashenmere cheese by name. They had asked for the wheel with the crossed keys, and they wished to know when the next would be ready. The word traveled the lane before the agent's pony did. By spring, the baker's wife came herself with a basket and stood in the yard and said only, "I was wrong to say what I said." Eleanor gave her a corner of a wheel and would take nothing for it. 2 girls out of the village asked for work in the dairy, and Eleanor took them both. The boy from the forge came up and asked, red to the ears, if there was anything wanted mended, and there was. Squire Hallworth came at last on a bright cold morning in March, without his crop, on foot. He stood at the paddock gate and would not come further until Eleanor came out to him. He was smaller than she remembered. He said, "I spoke ill of this place and of you. I was in the wrong of it." He looked past her at the dairy roof, newly slated, and at the ash trees coming into bud. "I hope you'll accept it said?" Eleanor said, "It is said." He touched his hat as he had done in the road that first day, but slowly, and he walked back down the lane the way he had come. She did not watch him go. She went inside to turn the wheels. In April, a letter came addressed in a clerk's hand from the office of the Duke of Ashenmere. Inside were 2 lines in an old man's shaky writing, thanking her for what she had done at the dairy that no one else would keep, and a lease of the buildings and the paddock in her own name for the term of her life, at a peppercorn. She read it twice, folded it, and put it in the tin box on the shelf above the hearth, beside Jonas Weiler's notebook and the bundle of letters she had at last, one winter evening, untied and read. She had learned then whose first name had been chiseled from the beam, and by whose hand, and why. And she had learned that a promise made to a quiet man in 1841 had gone unkept for 22 years, and that a room, if it is spoken to kindly, will wait. By late summer, the paddock was green to the wall, and the ash trees hung heavy over the yard, and the low sun in the evenings came in through the high window of the dairy, and lay in long bars across the flagstones Eleanor had scrubbed on her second day. She was 23 by then. Her hands were still red at the knuckles and would not unredden, but they were sure now, and steady, and they knew the weight of a wheel to the ounce without the scale. The gray cat, no longer thin, slept most afternoons on the sunny corner of the thrall in the cellar, one paw across its notched ear. On an evening in September, a year to the day since the coach had set her down at the crossroads, Eleanor walked the buildings once, as she had walked them every night since the first. She passed the copper on its bracket, gleaming dully. She passed the shelves in the cheese room, where wheels stood in ranks now under the penciled names she had learned to read. She passed under the low beam in the byre, and touched the letters of Jonas Weiler's surname and the date, and beside them, a fresh cut she had made herself with a fine knife, the year 1864, and beneath it, her own name. She stood at the paddock gate at the last of the light. The ash trees were still. The child Whitcomb, older now by a year and no longer blue about the mouth, had come up that morning on her father's cart with a jar of honey and a drawing on brown paper, and the drawing was pinned to the cottage wall. The land agent, who had ridden up that afternoon with news of another order out of London, had asked her, standing in the yard, what she thought she had built here. Eleanor had looked at the dairy and the byre, and the cellar hatch behind, and the cottage with its smoke going straight up in the still air, and at the cat sitting on the sun-warmed step. "A kept room," she said. "Nothing more." He had not answered her, only nodded once, and gone. Now, alone at the gate in the gold, she stood a long while and did not move. A blackbird sang from the spinney. Somewhere along the lane a cart went by and did not stop, and the sound of its wheels went softly away into the evening. Eleanor turned at last and walked back across the yard to the cottage, and the cat rose from the step and went in ahead of her, and she closed the door. Thank you for staying to the end of this one, for sitting with a quiet girl and a shunned dairy and a name cut from a beam. If the slow mending of a forgotten room moved you, please leave a like. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Another lantern is already lit, and we'll see you there.